May 16, 1980. A sunny Thursday afternoon in Minnesota. Mary Stair, a 36-year-old mathematics teacher and devoted mother, emerges from a local beauty salon with her 8-year-old daughter, Beth. It's an ordinary spring day, the kind where nothing terrible is supposed to happen. Mary has an appointment to keep her hair neat before her family's missionary trip to the Philippines, scheduled to depart in just 4 days. She's looking forward to returning to the work that gives her life meaning, serving communities thousands of miles from home. But as they walk toward their green sedan in the parking lot, a stranger in a leather jacket and dark sunglasses approaches. At first glance, Mary's instinct is to help. Growing up in a deeply religious household in 1940s Minnesota, she was taught to see the good in people, to extend a helping hand to those who might be lost or in need of directions. This ingrained kindness, this fundamental belief in human decency, is about to become her nightmare. The man pulls out a gun and points it directly at Beth's head. In that single moment, what began as an ordinary day transforms into a chilling true story that would expose the dark underbelly of obsession, the failures of a mental health system, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide in plain sight for decades. This is the story of Ming Sen Shue, a man whose twisted fantasy world collided catastrophically with reality, leaving multiple victims in its wake and forever changing how we understand the deadly progression from obsession to violence. It is a real crime documentary that reveals how one teacher's compassion became the focal point of a disturbed mind and how a 6-year-old boy named Jason Wilkman paid the ultimate price for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you're drawn to these dark histories and chilling true stories like I am, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's delve into this disturbing case. It began not with violence, but with a family's hope for a better life in America. The story of Ming Sen Shue begins in 1950 in Taiwan, with what should have been a tale of immigrant success and the American dream realized. Born on October 15th to parents who would later adapt their names to Mary and Jim Shue for American convenience, Ming entered the world during a period of tremendous upheaval in Chinese history. His parents represented the educated elite who had fled mainland China, carrying with them not just their possessions, but their dreams of educational advancement and professional success. Jim Shue was no ordinary immigrant. He was a highly respected forestry researcher whose expertise had earned him recognition across academic circles in Taiwan. Mary, his wife, was equally accomplished, teaching mathematics at several universities, despite the cultural barriers that often prevented women from achieving such positions in the 1950s. These were individuals who had already proven their exceptional capabilities in their homeland, making their decision to emigrate to America not one of desperation, but of ambition. The invitation for Jim to head the forestry department at the University of Minnesota was not just a job offer, it was validation of everything the family had worked toward. In 1957, when 7-year-old Ming arrived in Minnesota with his parents, he was entering a world of possibility that his parents had sacrificed everything to provide. Soon after their arrival, the family welcomed two more sons, Charles and Ron, completing what appeared to be a perfect portrait of immigrant success. But the 1950s American dream came with invisible pressures that would prove devastating to the Shue family. The cultural expectations placed on Chinese immigrant families were immense. They were expected to be model minorities, excelling academically while quietly assimilating into American society. The pressure to succeed was not just personal, it carried the weight of representing their entire cultural heritage to their American neighbors and colleagues. This cultural backdrop becomes crucial to understanding what happened next, because when tragedy struck the Shue household, the family's response was shaped not just by grief, but by deeply ingrained cultural traditions that would prove catastrophically misapplied in their new American context. When Ming turned 11, his father Jim succumbed to a brief but devastating illness. In a culture where the father's role as family patriarch was absolute, his death created a vacuum that traditional Chinese family structure demanded be filled immediately. On his deathbed, Jim made a decision that he believed would preserve his family's honor and stability. He called his eldest son to his side and, in keeping with centuries of Chinese tradition, informed Ming that he was now the eldest male and must assume all masculine responsibilities for the household. This moment represents one of the most tragic miscalculations in this entire dark history. Jim Shue was dying, desperate to ensure his family's survival in a foreign country where they had no extended family support system. His intention was to instill responsibility and maturity in his 11-year-old son. What he couldn't have anticipated was how literally Ming would interpret these dying words, or how the boy's developing psyche would warp this traditional guidance into something monstrous. The transformation was swift and terrifying. Within weeks of the funeral, Ming had appointed himself not just the man of the house, but a tyrannical dictator ruling over his younger brothers with cruelty that defies comprehension. 6-year-old Charles and 3-year-old Ron became, in Ming's twisted interpretation of his new role, personal servants whose every action required his approval. The daily routine Ming established reveals the methodical nature of his psychological domination. When he returned from school each day, his brothers were required to perform an elaborate ritual of subservience, greeting him at the door, removing his jacket and backpack, organizing his school materials, and removing his shoes and socks while he settled onto the couch like a feudal lord. The specific nature of these demands, exact number of crackers that must accompany his soup, the precise level of milk in his glass shows an obsessive-compulsive element that would later manifest in his stalking behavior. But it was the punishments that revealed the true darkness developing in Ming's character. When his brothers failed to meet his exacting standards, the beatings were administered with methodical cruelty. These weren't the impulsive swats of a frustrated child, they were calculated, prolonged sessions of violence designed to reinforce his absolute authority. The belt became his instrument of choice, and the psychological terror he inflicted was as damaging as the physical abuse. Perhaps the most chilling incident occurred when 5-year-old Ron committed some minor infraction that displeased his older brother. Ming's response was to force the child into an electric oven, slamming the door shut and manipulating the heat controls while the terrified boy was trapped inside. This wasn't just abuse, it was torture, conducted with the same methodical precision that would later characterize his adult crimes. The boys' desperate appeals to their mother reveal another layer of this tragedy. Mary Shue, overwhelmed by grief and struggling to maintain her position at the university while raising 3 sons alone, made a decision that would haunt the family for decades. Rather than intervening in Ming's increasingly abusive behavior, she deferred to what she perceived as cultural tradition, telling her younger sons that Ming was now the head of the family and they must obey him. This response illuminates the dangerous intersection of cultural tradition and American individualism that many immigrant families struggled to navigate in the 1950s and 1960s. Mary Shue was trapped between her understanding of traditional Chinese family hierarchy and her new American reality, where such absolute patriarchal authority was both impractical and harmful. Her inability to recognize that her 11-year-old son was not mature enough to handle such responsibility would have consequences that extended far beyond their household. As Ming entered adolescence, his behavior took on increasingly disturbing dimensions that should have triggered immediate intervention. The neighborhood incidents peeping into windows, gaining a reputation as a juvenile perverter, clear warning signs that his developing sexuality was becoming twisted with his need for power and control. But perhaps most alarming was his growing fixation on his own mother, a psychological development that would later be channeled toward his algebra teacher with devastating consequences. The incidents involving Mary Shue were not mere teenage awkwardness or curiosity. Ming's systematic attempts to view and touch his mother's body while she slept represent a profound disturbance in normal psychological development. When Mary finally discovered her son under her blanket with a flashlight, having cut a hole in her pajamas to examine her private parts, she was confronted with evidence of a psychological pathology that demanded immediate professional intervention. Yet even this shocking discovery failed to prompt the decisive action that might have changed the trajectory of this story. Mary's response to ignore the situation and hope it would resolve itself. Both the stigma surrounding mental illness in the 1960s and the particular challenges faced by immigrant families who feared that seeking help might bring unwanted attention from authorities. This avoidance of confronting Ming's escalating pathology was compounded by his increasingly dangerous behavior toward the broader community. The house fires he set and the rocks he threw at passing cars weren't pranks, they were expressions of a growing need to exert power and create chaos in his environment. These actions finally prompted police intervention and the psychiatric evaluation that could have saved multiple lives. The psychiatric ward evaluation revealed the depth of Ming's psychological disturbance. Doctors who examined him noted his pathological lying, his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions, and most significantly, his inappropriate sexual interest in his mother. Their recommendation for long-term treatment was based on a clear assessment that he posed a serious danger to society if left untreated. But here we encounter one of the most tragic examples of bureaucratic failure in this entire case. So when a clerk, an administrator, a medical records technician incorrectly filled out Ming's paperwork, his patient information was never properly entered into the system. Despite clear documentation of his dangerous pathology and explicit recommendations for extended treatment, Ming Sen Shue was discharged after just a few days due to this clerical error. This administrative failure represents more than just human error. It reflects the systemic inadequacies of mental health care in the 1960s, particularly for adolescents exhibiting early signs of severe personality disorders. The institutions and procedures that should have protected society from individuals like Ming were fragmented, underfunded, and vulnerable to the kind of simple mistakes that would prove catastrophic. Had Ming received the long-term psychiatric treatment that doctors recommended, the events that followed might never have occurred. Jason Wilkman might have grown up to have children of his own. Mary and Beth Stauffer might have spent their lives serving communities in the Philippines without ever knowing how close they came to unimaginable terror. But instead, a disturbed 15-year-old boy was released back into society, his pathology not just untreated, but now reinforced by the belief that he could escape consequences for even the most disturbing behavior. As Ming entered Alexander Ramsey High School in the fall of 1965, he carried with him not just the unresolved psychological disturbances of his childhood, but a dangerous sense of invincibility born from having evaded serious consequences for increasingly serious transgressions. His new algebra teacher, Mary Stauffer, had no way of knowing that her kindness and professionalism would soon become the focal point of an obsession that would define the rest of her life. The collision course that would lead to unspeakable tragedy had been set in motion by a series of failures: cultural, familial, institutional, and bureaucratic. What followed would test not just the limits of human endurance, but the very systems designed to protect innocent people from those whose minds have been twisted beyond recognition. Mary Stauffer's arrival at Alexander Ramsey High School in 1965 represented everything positive about the American educational system of that era. Born on June 20th, 1943, she had grown up in a devoutly religious Minnesota family that instilled in her the values of service, compassion, and intellectual excellence. Her decision to major in mathematics was unjust about personal interest. It was about breaking barriers in a field where women were still vastly underrepresented. The cultural context of the mid-1960s is crucial to understanding both Mary's position and Ming's. This was the height of the post-war educational boom, when America was investing heavily in mathematics and science education in response to the Soviet space program. Female math teachers like Mary were pioneers, entering classrooms where they often faced skepticism from both students and colleagues who questioned whether women possessed the analytical minds necessary for advanced mathematics. Mary's marriage to her high school sweetheart Irvin in 1964 reflected the social expectations of the era. Despite her professional achievements, she was expected to balance her career with traditional domestic roles: her modest dress, conservative appearance, and commitment to her church community were just personal choices. They were survival strategies that allowed her to maintain credibility in a professional environment that remained skeptical of working women. When she began teaching at Alexander Ramsey High School, Mary brought with her not just mathematical expertise, but a genuine care for her students' success. She treated all her pupils with equal respect and encouragement, seeing potential in even the most challenging cases. This egalitarian approach, which would be celebrated today as exemplary teaching, became the foundation of Ming's dangerous delusion. From his first day in Mary's algebra class, Ming's reaction was unlike anything a teacher would typically encounter. This wasn't the common teenage crush that educators learn to navigate with gentle professionalism. Ming's response to Mary was immediate, intense, and fundamentally distorted by the psychological pathologies that had been developing since his father's death. The specific elements that attracted Ming to Mary reveal the depth of his psychological disturbance. The fact that both women were named Mary was uncoincidental. It provided a psychological bridge between his inappropriate desires for his mother and his new fixation. Both women were mathematics teachers, both dressed modestly and conservatively. Both represented maternal figures who combined intellectual authority with nurturing potential. This pattern would later extend to Ming's fantasies about television actresses like Shirley Jones from the Partridge Family, Florence Henderson from the Brady Bunch, and Julie Andrews from The Sound of Music. All of these women shared specific characteristics: short haircuts, modest dress, maternal roles that aligned with Ming's twisted idealization of the perfect woman. They weren't sex symbols in the conventional sense. They were mother figures onto whom he projected his confused desires for both maternal love and sexual possession. Ming's conviction that Mary secretly harbored romantic feelings for him represents a classic symptom of what psychologists now recognize as a delusional belief that another person is in love with the sufferer. This condition often develops in individuals with narcissistic personality disorders, who possess such grandiose self-concepts that they cannot conceive of anyone not finding them irresistible. The elaborate fantasy world Ming constructed around his relationship with Mary became increasingly detailed and consuming. His erotic novels were unsimple teenage fantasies. They were complex narratives that revealed his need to see himself as a romantic hero rescuing damsels in distress. The Victorian novel format he chose reflects his inability to process modern relationships based on equality and mutual consent. In his stories, women were always eventually overwhelmed by his masculine perfection and surrendered to desires they had been too shy or constrained to express. These literary works served multiple psychological functions for Ming. They allowed him to process his obsessive thoughts in a way that felt creative and meaningful. They reinforced his grandiose self-image by casting him as the irresistible protagonist. And they provided a safe space to explore the violent and possessive impulses that would later manifest in his crimes. The fact that some of these stories were later published online reveals Ming's desire for validation of his fantasies. He was uncontent to keep his delusions private. He needed external confirmation that his romantic vision was compelling and believable. This need for validation would later drive his increasingly bold attempts to insert himself into Mary's life. During the 2 years Ming studied under Mary's instruction, her professional demeanor never wavered. She treated him exactly as she treated all her students, with respect, fairness, and appropriate boundaries. She had no way of knowing that every smile, every word of encouragement, every normal interaction was being filtered through Ming's delusional framework and interpreted as secret communication of her romantic interest. This misinterpretation of normal social cues represents another hallmark of obsessive disorders. Ming's mind transformed Mary's professional kindness into evidence of hidden passion, her public restraint into proof that she was protecting their secret love from social disapproval. Every moment she spent with him in the context of her teaching duties became, in his mind, stolen time between lovers forced to hide their true feelings. The intensity of Ming's obsession during these years cannot be overstated. His every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of Mary. His academic performance, his social interactions, his family relationships, everything became secondary to maintaining and feeding this delusion. The hours he spent writing about her, fantasizing about their imagined future together, and analyzing her every word and gesture represented a level of psychological fixation that should have been recognized as dangerous. But the social and institutional contexts of the 1960s provided no framework for identifying or addressing this kind of obsessive behavior. Teachers were expected to inspire their students, and a student's intense interest in academic subjects was generally viewed as positive. The concept of stalking as a distinct category of criminal behavior would unemerge in legal frameworks until decades later. Mental health professionals had limited understanding of obsessive disorders, and school systems had no protocols for identifying students whose fixation on teachers crossed into dangerous territory. When Mary announced in 1968 that she would be leaving Alexander Ramsey High School to accompany her husband on a missionary assignment to the Philippines, she had no way of anticipating the psychological crisis this would trigger in one of her students. For Ming, this announcement was unjust disappointing. It was a betrayal of everything he believed about their relationship and his destiny. The timing of Mary's departure coincided with Ming's senior year, when 18-year-old students are typically focused on college preparations and future planning. For most students, a favorite teacher's departure might be cause for sadness, but ultimately just one of many transitions marking the end of their high school experience. For Ming, it represented the collapse of his entire psychological framework. His response to this crisis, throwing himself into academic achievement and extracurricular activities, might have appeared healthy to outside observers. His straight A's, his success in academic competitions, his involvement in football and basketball all seemed to indicate a high-achieving student preparing for college success. The recognition he received as the most promising student in his graduating class appeared to validate his exceptional potential. But beneath this facade of achievement, Ming's psychological state was deteriorating rapidly. The academic success and athletic accomplishments were genuine personal growth. They were desperate attempts to make himself worthy of Mary's love when she inevitably returned to claim him. Every achievement was motivated not by personal satisfaction or future planning, but by the delusional belief that excellence would somehow compel Mary to abandon her husband and her missionary work to be with him. The 1 year Ming spent at the University of Minnesota before dropping out reveals the fragility of his psychological state. Without the structure of high school and the daily possibility of encountering Mary, he was left alone with his obsessive thoughts and unrealistic expectations. The academic environment that should have challenged and developed his undeniable intellectual gifts instead became a source of stress that exposed his underlying mental instability. His decision to return home and start an electronics repair business was on evidence of entrepreneurial spirit. It was a retreat into a controlled environment where he could nurture his fantasies without external challenges to his delusional thinking. The success of his business, which eventually grew to be valued at $250,000, demonstrated his intelligence and technical skills, but it also provided him with the resources and isolation that would later enable his crimes. The years Ming spent alone in his family's basement, emerging only to work and immediately retreating back to his private world, represent a critical period in the development of his pathology. Without normal social relationships to challenge his distorted thinking, his obsession with Mary became increasingly elaborate and disconnected from reality. The basement became a laboratory where his fantasies could develop unchecked, fed by television shows and movies that reinforced his idealized vision of maternal femininity. His hygiene deterioration and social isolation were signs of depression, and the conventional sense they were symptoms of a mind that had completely withdrawn from reality in favor of an internal world where his delusions could flourish without contradiction. When his mother remarried and moved to Virginia, leaving Ming alone with his brothers, even the minimal external reality checks provided by family interaction were removed. The significance of the 1970s Italian film The Teacher and Ming's psychological development cannot be overstated. This erotic comedy about a young man, his relationship with an older woman, provided what Ming interpreted as external validation of his obsessive beliefs. In his mind, the film wasn't fiction, it was a documentary about his own destined relationship with Mary Stay. This represents a crucial escalation in Ming's pathology. Previously, his delusions had been purely internal, sustained by his own fantasy life and misinterpretation of past events. The film provided what he perceived as cultural confirmation that his obsession was not only normal, but romantic and desirable. The explicit scenes and the plot of a student-teacher relationship legitimized his fantasies in a way that made them feel not just possible but inevitable. The incident with his mother during one of her visits reveals how Ming's exopathology continued to manifest. Even as he approached his attempt to lie in bed with her was unmotivated by confusion or momentary poor judgment. It was the continuation of a pattern that had begun in his early adolescence. Her rejection of his advances didn't lead to self-reflection or recognition that his behavior was inappropriate. Instead, it reinforced his conviction that Mary Stare was his only suitable romantic target. This rejection by his mother served to intensify rather than diminish his obsession with Mary. In Ming's distorted thinking, his mother's refusal to accept his advances proved that Mary was the woman fate had chosen for him. The 8 years that had passed since he last saw Mary were evidence that he should move on. They were merely a test of his devotion that would make their eventual reunion even more meaningful. The decision to track down Mary's location marks the transition from fantasy to action, from obsession to stalking, from mental illness to criminal behavior. Ming's methodical search through directories and address books was unimpulsive. It was the calculated first step in a plan that he had been developing for years, in the isolation of his basement fantasy world. When he discovered the address associated with Irvin Stare's name, Ming believed he had found the key to his destiny. The fact that this led him to break into the home of an elderly couple who turned out to be Mary's in-laws reveals both his desperation and his willingness to commit increasingly serious crimes in pursuit of his obsession. The home invasion itself, armed with a gun, tying up innocent elderly people. Ransacking their home demonstrated that Ming had crossed the line from disturbed individual to dangerous criminal. His threat to kill the elderly couple if they contacted police was empty, warning it was evidence of his complete willingness to commit violence in pursuit of his goals. The fact that they reported the incident anyway, despite their terror, provided law enforcement with their first concrete evidence of Ming's criminal behavior, though they had no way of connecting it to his obsession with Mary Stay. The years Ming spent in isolation after this failed attempt to locate Mary were a period of reflection or rehabilitation. Instead, they were an extended preparation period during which his delusions continued to grow more elaborate, and his determination to possess Mary became more absolute. He convinced himself that her continued absence was simply a test of his devotion, and that their eventual reunion was not just possible but predestined. When the local newspaper article announced Mary and Irvin's return from the Philippines in 1979, Ming interpreted this not as a simple news item, but as a divine sign that their time had finally come. The fact that Mary now had two children, 7-year-old Elizabeth and younger son Steve Shute, had made clear that she had built a life completely separate from any connection to her former student. But in Ming's delusional framework, these children were obstacles to be overcome, not evidence that his fantasies were completely detached from Mary's reality. The year of stalking that followed represents one of the most intensive and methodical campaigns of surveillance in the annals of true crime. Ming's daily observations of the Stair family, his memorization of their schedules and preferences, his presence at Mary's speaking engagements, and the family's church services all demonstrate a level of systematic intrusion that should have triggered intervention if anyone had recognized the pattern. But the social and legal frameworks of 1979 provided no protection against this kind of behavior. Stalking laws didn't exist. The concept of restraining orders for non-domestic situations was virtually unknown. Mary had no way of knowing that she was being watched. And even if she had noticed Ming's presence, there would have been no legal recourse unless he committed a specific crime. The decision to kidnap Mary when he learned of the family's planned return to the Philippines was under sudden impulse. It was the logical culmination of Ming's delusional thinking. In his mind, he wasn't planning to commit a crime. He was planning to rescue the woman he loved from a marriage that prevented her from expressing her true feelings for him. The basement room he prepared was was a love nest where Mary would finally be free to acknowledge what he believed was their mutual passion. This complete disconnect between Ming's perception and reality would characterize every aspect of the crimes that followed. In his mind, he was the romantic hero from his novels, finally taking action to claim his destined love. The fact that this required kidnapping, imprisonment, and violence was simply the price that society's conventions demanded for true love to prevail. The several failed attempts to abduct Mary reveal both Ming's determination and his growing desperation as the departure date for the Philippines approached. Each failed attempt: the broken window, the tampering with the security system, the hole drilled in the ceiling of the apartment represented an escalation in both his criminal behavior and his psychological deterioration. The final attempt, when he listened to Mary and Irvin's private conversation from beneath their bed, represents perhaps the most chilling violation of privacy in this entire case. The intimacy of a married couple's bedtime conversation, overheard by a delusional stalker who believed himself to be the woman's true love, illustrates the complete absence of boundaries in Ming's thinking. When Mary mentioned her appointment at the hairdresser, Ming heard not just practical information, but what he interpreted as fate, providing him with the perfect opportunity. May 16, 1980, would be the day his 15-year obsession finally culminated in action. What he could anticipate was that Mary's decision to bring her 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, would introduce a complication that would lead to consequences far beyond anything he had planned. The afternoon of May 16th began like countless others for Mary and Beth Stauffer. A routine trip to the beauty salon, a mother and daughter spending time together before a major family transition, the kind of ordinary moment that makes up the fabric of normal family life. Mary had no reason to suspect that this simple errand would transform into a nightmare that would forever change not just their lives, but serve as a watershed moment in our understanding of how obsession can escalate into the most heinous crimes. As they emerged from the salon and walked toward their green sedan in the parking lot, Mary's first glimpse of the stranger in the leather jacket and dark sunglasses triggered her instinctive desire to help. These response, rooted in her religious upbringing and years of teaching experience, reflects the fundamental decency that makes the subsequent events so particularly tragic. Mary Stair was a woman whose first impulse was always to see the good in people, to extend assistance to those who seemed lost or confused. This tendency to assume positive intent in others represents both the best of human nature and, tragically, one of the vulnerabilities that predators like Ming are skilled at exploiting. The contrast between Mary's openness to helping a stranger and Ming's calculated predatory approach illustrates the fundamental imbalance that makes such crimes possible. When Ming drew his gun and pointed it at Beth's head, he wasn't just committing an armed kidnapping. He was destroying the basic trust that allows society to function. The weapon in his hand represented not just physical force, but the complete violation of every social contract that permits strangers to approach each other in public spaces. This moment marks the collision between Ming's fantasy world and brutal reality, between his romantic delusions and the actual terror he was inflicting on innocent people. Mary's immediate response, offering money, help, anything to protect her daughter, reveals the instantaneous transformation from normal citizen to victim that characterizes violent crime. In seconds, she went from planning the practical details of their upcoming trip to the Philippines to calculating how to keep herself and her child alive. This psychological shift from everyday concerns to survival mode is something that no amount of preparation or education can fully prepare someone to handle. Ming's shock at Mary's failure to recognize him represents one of the most psychologically revealing moments in this entire case. For 15 years, he had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which Mary thought about him constantly, remembered every detail of their classroom interactions, and secretly longed for their reunion. The reality that she had no idea who he was didn't just disappoint. It shattered the fundamental premise upon which he had built his entire adult identity. This moment of recognition, or rather the absence of recognition, should have forced Ming to confront the delusional nature of his obsession. Instead, it triggered a rage that would drive the violence that followed. In his narcissistic worldview, Mary's failure to remember him was evidence that his feelings were unrequited. It was evidence that she was deliberately denying their connection to protect herself from social disapproval. The presence of 8-year-old Beth in the car created a complication that Ming's fantasies had never accounted for. In his elaborate scenarios, Mary existed as an idealized maternal figure who could become his perfect partner once freed from the constraints of her marriage. Children evidence of Mary's actual life and relationships didn't fit into this fantasy framework. Beth represented not just an unexpected logistical challenge, but a psychological threat to Ming's ability to maintain his delusions about Mary's availability and desire for him. The drive to the secluded area where Ming planned to transfer his captives to his van reveals his methodical preparation combined with his increasing desperation. As reality failed to conform to his expectations, the rope he used to tie up Mary and Beth, the prepositioned bond. The choice of location all demonstrate that this wasn't a spontaneous crime of passion, but a carefully planned operation that Ming had been rehearsing in his mind for months. The tragic involvement of Jason Wilkman transforms this case from a story of obsession and kidnapping into something far more horrific. Jason's presence in the park where Ming was transferring his captives was purely coincidental, a child playing outdoors on a pleasant spring afternoon. Drawn by curiosity to what appeared to be a situation where someone might need help, Jason's decision to approach the car when he heard Mary and Beth screaming reveals the same instinct to help others that had made Mary vulnerable to Ming's approach at the salon. This 6-year-old boy, described by all who knew him as sweet, happy, and naturally curious, was motivated by the desire to assist people he thought were in distress. The tragic irony that this compassionate impulse led to his death illustrates how predators exploit the very qualities that make us human. Ming's response to discovering Jason as a witness reveals the cold calculation beneath his romantic delusions. Despite all his elaborate fantasies about love and destiny, when faced with a practical obstacle to his plans, he didn't hesitate to grab an innocent child and force him into his scheme. This action strips away any remaining pretense that Ming's crimes were motivated by passion rather than selfish entitlement and complete disregard for others. The decision to kill Jason Wilkman marks Ming's complete transformation from delusional stalker to cold-blooded murderer. the exact details of Jason's death, the tire iron or metal rod, the 2 blows to the head, the shallow grave covered with dirt and leaves represent not just the end of a young life, but the moment when Ming's fantasy world demanded its first ultimate sacrifice. The methodical way Ming disposed of Jason's body, taking time to hide the evidence, despite the risk of being discovered with his other captives, reveals a level of criminal sophistication that contradicts any notion that these were crimes of passion or mental illness-induced confusion. Ming knew exactly what he was doing, understood the consequences, and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. When Mary and Beth later asked what happened to the boy they had seen forced into the trunk with them, Ming's lied that he had left Jason somewhere safe where he would easily be found. Represents another layer of his pathological dishonesty. Even in the midst of committing the most serious crimes, he was concerned about maintaining Mary's good opinion of him, unable to face the reality that his actions had made him a child killer. The hours Ming spent driving around the area after murdering Jason, waiting for darkness before transferring Mary and Beth to his van, provide insight into his psychological state during the commission of these crimes. This was an man consumed by uncontrollable impulses. This was someone making calculated decisions about timing and logistics while carrying out a premeditated plan. The fact that Mary's green car somehow avoided police attention during these hours represents one of the most frustrating near misses in this investigation. Timmy, the other boy who witnessed Jason's abduction, had provided police with a description of both the car and the suspected kidnapper. A massive search was underway, yet somehow the very vehicle they were looking for remained undetected on the streets where Ming was driving it. This failure of the initial police response illustrates the limitations of law enforcement capabilities in 19. Before the sophisticated communication and coordination systems that exist today, the disconnect between witness reports and actual police patrols on the street created a window of opportunity that Ming exploited to complete his crimes and establish what would become a prolonged captivity. The arrival at Ming's house after midnight marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test every limit of human endurance and psychological resilience. The basement storage room Ming had prepared with its chains, blanket on the floor, bucket for a toilet toisund, the romantic hideaway of his fantasies, but a prison designed to break the will of his captives. The psychological dynamics of the first hours of captivity reveal the different ways people respond to extreme trauma. Beth's screaming and crying represented a normal child's response to terror and confusion. Mary's attempts to stay composed for her daughter's sake demonstrate the incredible strength that parents can find when their children's welfare is at stake, even under the most impossible circumstances. Mary's decision to pray during these first horrible hours was unjust. Reflection of her religious faith, it was a psychological survival strategy that allowed her to maintain hope and purpose even when facing the unthinkable. This spiritual foundation would prove crucial in sustaining her through the weeks of captivity that followed. The complete darkness of the storage room wasn't just a practical security measure, it was a form of psychological torture designed to disorient the captives and increase their dependence on their captor. Sensory deprivation is recognized as one of the most effective methods of breaking down psychological resistance, and Ming's use of this technique reveals either instinctive knowledge of psychological manipulation or deliberate study of coercive methods. The immediate mobilization of law enforcement when Irvinstay reported his wife and daughter missing demonstrates the difference between a missing person case involving a middle-class family and the typical response to disappearances in other communities. Mary's status as an educated professional woman with community connections ensured that her disappearance received immediate and serious attention. The connection between Mary's missing car and Jason Wilkman's abduction created the investigative breakthrough that elevated this from a local missing person case to a federal investigation involving multiple agencies. The FBI's immediate involvement brought resources and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't match. But even their capabilities would be tested by the methodical way Ming had planned and executed his crimes. The discovery of Mary's abandoned car near the park provided crucial physical evidence, but it also marked the end of the obvious investigative leads. The vehicle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and Ming's careful choice of the transfer location meant there were no witnesses to his movement of the captives to his van. The investigation was entering the most difficult phase, trying to track a perpetrator who had planned meticulously and left few traces. Meanwhile, in the basement of the Shieway house, Mary and Beth were beginning their ordeal in earnest. The psychological impact of the first night in captivity cannot be overstated. Chained in complete darkness, with no knowledge of where they were or what their captor intended, both mother and daughter faced the fundamental terror of complete helplessness. The second day of captivity brought Mary face to face with her kidnapper for the first time since the initial moments in the parking lot. Ming's decision to separate her from Beth for their private conversation reveals his continued belief that he could somehow make Mary understand and accept their supposed connection. The video camera he set up was onto just for his later gratification. It was evidence of his grandiose belief that he was documenting a historic reunion between destined lovers. The conversation itself exposes the complete disconnect between Ming's perception and reality. His patient explanation of their shared past at Alexander Ramsey High School, his expectation that Mary would suddenly remember and acknowledge their special bond, his genuine confusion at her continued failure to recognize him all, reveal a mind that had spent 15 years constructing an alternate reality that bore no resemblance to actual events. Mary's honest admission that she couldn't remember Ming, despite his lengthy explanations about their classroom interactions, wasn't cruelty or deliberate dismissal. It was the natural response of a professional educator who had taught hundreds of students over the years. Her memory of Bob, a troublesome student, instead of Ming, the supposedly exceptional pupil, triggered a rage that would characterize their entire interaction. Ming's fabricated story about the B- grade that supposedly ruined his life reveals both his need to justify his actions and his complete inability to accept responsibility for his own choices. The elaborate lie about being drafted, serving in Vietnam, and becoming a prisoner of war was unjust deception. It was Ming's attempt to cast himself as a victim whose crimes were justified by the injustices he had supposedly suffered. This fictional narrative also demonstrates Ming's understanding that his real motivations 15 years of sexual obsession with a teacher who barely remembered him were too pathetic and disturbing to acknowledge, even to himself. The war hero persona was more compatible with his grandiose self-image than the reality of a mentally disturbed man who had never moved beyond a teenage fantasy. The sexual assaults that began on the second day of captivity marked the complete destruction of any pretense that Ming's crimes were motivated by love rather than power and control. The systematic nature of these attacks, conducted while Mary was chained and helpless, filmed from Ming's later viewing, represents some of the most depraved aspects of this case. The psychological impact of these assaults extended far beyond the immediate physical trauma. Mary was forced to endure not just the attacks themselves, but Ming's continued insistence that she should learn to enjoy them, that she should respond with affection and passion. This demand that she participate willingly in her own victimization represents a level of psychological cruelty that compounds the horror of the physical crimes. Ming's filming of these assaults reveals the narcissistic nature of his pathology. These recordings were Yuan's for sexual gratification. They were his attempt to create evidence of the consensual romantic relationship he believed would eventually develop. In his delusional framework, he was documenting the beginning of their love story, not creating evidence of serious felonies. The daily routine that developed during the early weeks of captivity illustrates how quickly human beings can be forced to adapt to even the most abnormal circumstances. Mary and Beth's existence became defined by the rhythm of Ming's work, schedule locked in darkness. During the day, sometimes allowed out for meals and limited interaction in the evening, always under the threat of immediate violence. Attempted to resist or escape. Ming's knowledge of their food preferences, gained through months of stalking, created an additional layer of psychological intimidation. The fact that he could provide Beth's favorite snacks and prepare Mary's preferred meals demonstrated the depth of his surveillance and his complete invasion of their privacy long before the actual kidnapping occurred. The separation tactics Ming employed, taking Beth away from her mother for hours at a time, represent a calculated attempt to break down their psychological resistance. The 8-year-old girl's her pulling behavior wasn't just nervous habit, it was a physical manifestation of the trauma response. Her body's attempt to cope with stress that was literally beyond her ability to process. Mary's discovery of the dry cleaning receipt with Ming's address represents the first glimmer of hope in what had seemed like a completely hopeless situation. This small piece of evidence, forgotten in the chaos of Ming's preparations, provided Mary with crucial information that could potentially lead to their rescue if they could find a way to communicate it to the outside world. Her decision to memorize the address and teach it too. Beth reveals both her strategic thinking under extreme stress and her recognition that their survival might depend on the slim chance that one of them could escape to report their location. The destruction of the receipt itself shows Mary's understanding that even this small advantage had to be protected from discovery. The forged letter Ming forced Mary to write to her husband represents another escalation in his criminal sophistication. By attempting to convince authorities that Mary had left voluntarily, Ming was trying to end the search that posed the greatest threat to his continued possession of his captives. This was the action of someone consumed by uncontrollable passion. It was the calculated move of a criminal trying to avoid detection. The FBI's recognition that the letter was written under duress demonstrates their growing understanding of the case they were dealing with. Their decision toward immediate silence was an abandonment of the investigation. It was a strategic choice designed to give Ming a false sense of security that might lead him to make mistakes that would reveal his location. This media blackout created an additional burden for the Stair family, who were forced to endure not just the absence of their loved ones, but the absence of public attention that might have aided in their discovery. Irvin Stair's faith in the investigation, despite the apparent lack of progress, required tremendous strength and trust in law enforcement capabilities. The discovery of Jason Wilkman remains provided confirmation of what investigators had feared but hoped was untrue. The small body hidden in the wildlife management area, the evidence of blunt force trauma, the crude burial site, all painted a picture of a crime that had escalated far beyond kidnapping into the most serious category of violent felony. Jason's murder also provided crucial evidence about the perpetrator's willingness to kill. This wasn't someone who might be reasoned with or who would necessarily spare his other victims. The investigation took on new urgency with the understanding that Mary and Beth might be in immediate mortal danger. The weeks that followed established a horrific routine that would test every limit of human endurance. Mary's continued resistance to Ming's sexual demands, her refusal to pretend affection or participation, demonstrates a level of courage that is difficult to comprehend. Despite being completely powerless, despite facing daily assault, despite having her daughter's safety used as leverage against her, she maintained her fundamental dignity and refused to validate Ming's delusions. The incident with the plastic bag over Beth's head represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating moment of their captivity. Ming's willingness to torture a child to force her mother's compliance reveals the complete absence of moral boundaries in his thinking. The choice Mary faced to allow her daughter to suffocate or provide the affection Ming demanded illustrates the impossible positions that victims of such crimes are forced to navigate. Mary's eventual compliance, kissing Ming to save her daughter's life, was on weakness or capitulation. It was a mother's strategic decision to preserve her child's life while seeking other opportunities for resistance or escape. The psychological burden of this compromise, the guilt and trauma of being forced to show affection to her tormentor, represents an additional layer of victimization that extends far beyond physical abuse. The 3 weeks of basement captivity established patterns that would define the remainder of their ordeal. Ming's growing confidence, his belief that he had successfully evaded detection, his increasing willingness to allow his captives limited freedom within his house, all were building toward the decision that would ultimately lead to their escape. But first, Ming's grandiose vision of their relationship would lead to perhaps the most bizarre chapter of this entire case. A cross-country trip that would take their captivity from the basement of a Minnesota home to the streets of Chicago, transforming this case from a local investigation into a federal manhunt spanning multiple states. The decision to take Mary and Beth to Chicago for a business conference represents Ming's complete detachment from reality and his growing belief that he could maintain his crimes indefinitely. This was just a business trip, it was Ming's attempt to normalize their relationship by taking his family on what he perceived as a vacation together. The extensive preparations Ming made for this journey revealed both his criminal sophistication and his continued delusions about the nature of his relationship with his captives. The rental of a camper van, the cardboard covering all the windows, the detailed threats about what would happen if Mary or Beth attempted to seek help demonstrate his awareness that he was committing crimes, while simultaneously maintaining his fantasy that they were willing participants in this adventure. The psychological pressure on Mary and Beth during this interstate journey cannot be overstated. Confined in a moving vehicle with their captor completely cut off from the outside world, threatened with immediate death if they attempted to communicate their situation to anyone, they were experiencing a level of isolation and terror that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Ming's attendance at the actual business conference, while his captives waited in the sealed van, creates one of the most surreal aspects of this entire case. Here was a man conducting normal professional activities, discussing electronics and business matters with colleagues, all while holding two kidnapping victims prisoner just outside in the parking lot. This ability to compartmentalize, to function normally in one context, while committing the most serious crimes in another, illustrates the sophisticated nature of his pathology. The tour of Chicago that Ming provided for Mary and Beth was on a kindness or consideration for their comfort. It was his attempt to create the impression of a normal family outing that would validate his delusions about their relationship. The mall visits, the cafe stops, the various purchases, all were designed to reinforce his fantasy that they were willing participants in this experience. Mary's decision to pay for one purchase with a traveler's check, hoping it could be traced, demonstrates the incredible presence of mind she maintained, even under the most extreme circumstances. Despite the constant threat of violence, despite her exhaustion and trauma, she remained alert for any opportunity to leave a trail that might lead to their rescue. The failure of this check to generate any investigative leads illustrates one of the most frustrating aspects of this case: the number of near misses and missed opportunities that might have ended their ordeal weeks earlier. The sophisticated financial tracking systems we take for granted today simply didn't exist in 1980, leaving Mary's desperate attempt at communication unnoticed and ineffective. Beth's attempt to alert the teenagers outside their van window represents the courage and resourcefulness of a child who, despite her terror and trauma, recognized an opportunity to seek help. Her whispered explanation that she and her mother had been kidnapped should have triggered immediate assistance, but the teenager's dismissal of her plea as a prank illustrates how predators benefit from society's assumption that such extreme crimes do happen in ordinary settings. This incident also highlights one of the most tragic aspects of crimes against children: their natural trust in adults and their expectation that other people will help them when they in danger. The teenager's laughter and dismissal of Beth's desperate plea for help wasn't malicious, but it represents the kind of missed opportunity that haunts both survivors and investigators long after such cases are resolved. They returned to Minnesota after their Chicago vacation brought Ming to new levels of confidence and grandiosity. In his mind, the trip had been a complete success that proved he could maintain his possession of Mary and Beth indefinitely. The fact that they had traveled hundreds of miles, interacted with dozens of people, and returned without detection seemed to validate his belief that his plan was working perfectly. This confidence led to the decision that would ultimately provide Mary and Beth with their opportunity for freedom. Ming planned for a year-long cross-country trip. The elaborate nature of this scheme reveals how completely he had lost touch with reality. In his mind, a year of traveling together would finally convince Mary to accept their relationship and abandon any thoughts of returning to her previous life. The Father's Day phone call Ming allowed Beth to make to Irvin represents another example of his desire to appear considerate and caring while maintaining absolute control over his captives. The strict conditions he imposed, no mention of their location or his identity, ensured that the call would provide hope to the Stair family without compromising his security. For Irvin Stair, this brief contact with his daughter represented both tremendous relief and increased anguish. Hearing Beth's voice confirmed that she and Mary were alive, but the obvious constraints on what she could say made clear that they remained in grave danger. The call provided investigators with confirmation that their search should continue, but offered no practical leads toward actually finding the victims. The birthday celebration Ming forced Mary and Beth to participate in demonstrates his complete inability to recognize the horror of their situation from their perspective. In his mind, he was providing Mary with a special day, showing consideration for her happiness and comfort. The reality that he was forcing kidnapping victims to celebrate their captoress. Thoughtfulness illustrates the complete moral inversion of his worldview. The continued writing of romantic stories featuring Mary and Beth reveals how Ming's crimes were feeding his fantasy life rather than satisfying it. Rather than reality checks that might have challenged his delusions, the actual crimes became source material for even more elaborate fictional scenarios. The shift in his stories to include both mother and daughter suggests that his pathology was adapting to incorporate all aspects of his current situation. Pihuli 7, TH, the 53rd day of captivity. The psychological dynamics of their imprisonment had reached a critical point. Mary's recognition that Ming had no intention of ever releasing them was unsudden revelation, but the culmination of weeks of observation and analysis. His increasing comfort with their situation, his elaborate plans for extended travel, his complete absence of any discussion about eventual freedom all pointed to the terrifying conclusion that their captivity was intended to be permanent. The timing of Ron's departure on business created the opportunity Mary had been waiting for, but it also presented the greatest risk they had yet faced. Any escape attempt would be their only escape attempt. Failure would certainly result in increased security measures that would eliminate future opportunities, and might well result in immediate violent retaliation. Ming's decision to move them to a different closet for their comfort represents the kind of overconfidence that often leads to the downfall of even the most careful criminals. The reinforced hinges, removed doorknob, and heavy furniture that had secured their previous prison were security measures born of caution and experience. Their absence from the new location reflected Ming's growing belief that his captives had been successfully broken and no longer posed any threat to his control. The moment Mary realized she could remove the hinge pins represents one of the most crucial turning points in this entire case. After nearly 2 months of complete powerlessness, of enduring assault and imprisonment while maintaining hope for rescue that never came, she suddenly faced the possibility of taking control of their fate. The physical act of removing those pins, while chained to her daughter in a dark closet, required not just mechanical skill but incredible psychological courage. Mary knew that discovery would bring consequences too terrible to contemplate, but she also understood that passivity meant accepting permanent captivity for both herself and her child. The moment the door fell out of its frame must have seemed almost impossibly surreal after weeks of imprisonment. The psychological impact of that first glimpse of freedom, after so long in darkness and confinement, would have been overwhelming. But Mary's immediate focus on reaching the telephone and contacting police demonstrates the presence of mind and determination that had sustained her throughout their ordeal. The phone call to 911, made while still chained to her daughter, represents perhaps the most significant moment in this entire case. Mary's ability to provide their exact address, memorized from the dry cleaning receipt weeks earlier, transformed their situation from hopeless imprisonment to active rescue operation in a matter of minutes. The decision to flee the house and hide behind a parked car, despite the 911 dispatcher's advice to remain inside, reflects Mary's continued distrust of any situation that might leave them vulnerable to recapture. After weeks of complete powerlessness, she was unwilling to place their safety in anyone else's hands until law enforcement actually arrived on scene. The police response to their 911 call demonstrates both the efficiency of emergency services and the almost anticlimactic nature of their rescue, compared to the drama of their captivity. After weeks of elaborate FBI investigation, sophisticated surveillance techniques, and coordinated multi-agency efforts, Mary and Beth's freedom was ultimately secured by their own courage and resourcefulness. The initial confusion when police could unlocate them inside the house must have been terrifying for both mother and daughter. The fear that Ming might return while they waited for rescue, the possibility that their escape might be discovered before help arrived. These moments of vulnerability were perhaps as psychologically challenging as any aspect of their captivity. The sight of their chained forms hiding behind the car provided responding officers with immediate visual confirmation of the crimes they were investigating. The physical evidence of their imprisonment, their chains, their obvious malnutrition and trauma, their terror at being discovered transformed this from a missing person case into a clear-cut example of kidnapping and imprisonment. The medical attention Mary and Beth received at the hospital was unjust treatment for their physical condition. It was the beginning of a long process of recovery from trauma that would extend far beyond their physical healing. Maddie's 9-kilogram weight loss was merely the most visible sign of the toll their captivity had taken on their bodies and minds. The immediate questions about Jason Wilkman's whereabouts forced Mary to confront one of the most difficult aspects of their ordeal: the knowledge that their captor was also a murderer, and that Jason's fate had been sealed on the first day of their own captivity. The reality that they had survived an encounter with someone capable of killing a child would add another layer to their trauma recovery. Ming's arrest at his electronics business, conducted calmly as if it were all a misunderstanding, reveals his continued inability to accept the reality of his situation, even faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed fantasy. He maintained the delusion that he had done nothing wrong and that this was all some kind of mistake that would be quickly resolved. The confrontation between Ming and Mary at the sheriff's office represents one of the most psychologically revealing moments in this entire case. His genuine bewilderment at her escape. His inability to understand why she would want to leave him. His continued belief that she had betrayed their relationship all demonstrate how completely divorced from reality his thinking had become. This unexpected encounter also provided a stark contrast between victim and perpetrator that would characterize their later courtroom confrontations. Mary's obvious trauma and relief at being reunited with her family stood in sharp contrast to Ming's continued self-pity and incomprehension at the consequences of his actions. But even their rescue would not mark the end of Mary and Beth's ordeal. Ming's immediate threats of revenge, his attempts to arrange their murder from jail, his elaborate escape plans all demonstrated that their physical freedom didn't guarantee their safety from his continued obsession. The $50,000 bounty Ming offered for Mary and Beth's deaths was untempted threat or temporary. Regit was a calculated attempt to ensure they could never testify against him in court. His willingness to spend his considerable business assets on murder contracts reveals both the depth of his hatred for their escape and his continued belief that he could somehow control their fate, even from behind bars. The fellow inmate who reported Ming's murder solicitation to authorities represents one of the few positive turns. In this case, where the criminal justice system functioned as intended, rather than accepting payment for murder, this individual recognized an opportunity to aid justice, while potentially reducing his own sentence. A rare example of enlightened self-interest serving the cause of justice. Ming's attempted escape using foil from candy wrappers to disable the security system demonstrates both his continued technical ingenuity and his absolute refusal to accept the consequences of his crimes. Even facing overwhelming evidence and certain conviction, he remained focused on returning to complete his revenge against the women who had dared to resist his control. The transfer to constant surveillance, following his failed escape attempt, finally provided the security necessary to ensure Mary and Beth's safety during the legal proceedings that would follow. But their ordeal in court would prove almost as challenging as their physical captivity, as they faced the necessity of reliving their trauma in public while confronting the man who had caused it. The trial of Ming Sen Shue would become a landmark case in the prosecution of stalking and kidnapping crimes, establishing legal precedents that would influence how such cases were handled for decades to come. But more immediately, it would test the courage and resilience of two survivors who had already endured more than anyone should ever have to face. The September 9, 1980 trial date marked the beginning of legal proceedings that would finally hold Ming Sen Shue accountable for his crimes. But it also initiated a new phase of trauma for Mary and Beth Stauffer. The courtroom, which should have represented justice and closure, instead became another arena where they would be forced to confront their tormentor and relive the worst experiences of their lives in front of strangers. Ming's plea of not guilty to the kidnapping charges wasn't surprising, but it forced Mary to make one of the most difficult decisions of her life, whether to testify against the man who had held her captive and repeatedly assaulted her. The courage required for a sexual assault survivor to face their attacker in court cannot be overstated, particularly when that attacker had demonstrated such complete disregard for human life and continued to pose a threat even from jail. Mary's decision to testify was unjust personal bravery. It was a recognition that her testimony was crucial to ensuring Ming could never harm others. Her detailed recounting of their ordeal provided the court with first-hand evidence of crimes that might otherwise have been difficult to prove, given the isolated nature of their captivity and the absence of other adult witnesses. The defense team's attempt to argue insanity reveals the common legal strategy in cases involving clearly disturbed defendants, but it also highlights the important distinction between mental illness and criminal responsibility. The psychiatric evaluations that found no serious mental issues in Ming were denying that his behavior was abnormal. They were establishing that he understood the nature and consequences of his actions and chose to commit them anyway. This distinction is crucial to understanding how the legal system approaches cases like Ming's. Mental illness alone does not excuse criminal behavior, particularly when the defendant demonstrates the kind of sophisticated planning and awareness of consequences that characterized Ming's crimes. His ability to function normally in business settings, his elaborate preparations for the kidnapping, his systematic attempts to avoid detection all indicated a mind that was disturbed but not legally insane. Ming's courtroom behavior during Mary's testimony. Jumping from his seat, shouting questions, about why she had abandoned him provided the court with a real-time demonstration of his continued delusions and his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. His removal from the courtroom wasn't just a security measure. It was recognition that his presence was re-traumatizing his victim and disrupting the legal proceedings. The guilty verdict and 30-year sentence for kidnapping represented a significant victory for justice, but it was only the beginning of the legal consequences Ming would face. The second trial for Jason Wilkman's murder would prove even more challenging, both legally and emotionally, as it forced all involved to confront the most tragic aspect of this senseless death of an innocent child. Ming's decision to make a deal with prosecutors, revealing Jason's body location in exchange for a second-degree murder charge, wasn't motivated by remorse or desire to help Jason's family find closure. Instead, it was a calculated legal strategy designed to avoid the death penalty while still maintaining some control over the legal proceedings. Even facing life imprisonment, Ming was still trying to manipulate the system to his advantage. The discovery of Jason's remains provided his parents with the closure they desperately needed, but it also confirmed the worst fears about their son's fate. The small body in the shallow grave, the evidence of brutal violence against a 6-year-old child, the casual way Ming had disposed of the evidence all painted a picture of a crime that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. Mary's decision to testify again at the murder trial, knowing the risks and trauma it would involve, demonstrates a level of commitment to justice that few could match. Her testimony wasn't legally necessary for the prosecution of Jason's murder, but her presence in court served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of Ming's crimes and the courage required to stand up to such evil. The knife attack during Mary's testimony represents perhaps the most terrifying moment in the entire legal proceedings. Ming's ability to smuggle a weapon into the courtroom, his willingness to attack his victim in front of dozens of witnesses, his complete disregard for the additional criminal charges such an attack would bring all demonstrate that even facing multiple life sentences, he remained focused on inflicting pain on the woman who had escaped his control. The 62 stitches required to close Mary's facial wounds weren't just medical treatment. They were evidence of Ming's continued determination to mark and damage his victim even when he had nothing left to lose. The permanent scar this attack left on Mary's face would serve as a daily reminder of her ordeal for the rest of her life. But even this vicious attack couldn't deter Mary from completing her testimony. Her return to court to finish what she had started demonstrates a level of courage and determination that transformed her from victim to survivor to hero. Her refusal to be silenced by violence, her insistence on seeing justice done regardless of personal cost, inspired not just court officials but victims' rights advocates across the country. The 40-year sentence for Jason's murder, to be served concurrently with the previous 30-year term, ensured that Ming would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But more importantly, it sent a clear message that crimes against children would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of the perpetrator's mental state or supposed motivations. Ming's behavior in prison, making weapons, attacking other inmates, threatening guards, showing no remorse for his crimes, infirmed that his pathology extended far beyond his obsession with Mary's stay, his complete inability to function in any structured environment, his continued violence against anyone who represented authority, his absolute refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing all, indicated a personality so fundamentally disordered that rehabilitation was impossible. The transfer to maximum security wasn't just a response to his violent behavior, it was recognition that Ming represented a permanent threat to anyone around him. His continued obsession with Mary, his promises to track down and kill her family if he ever gained freedom, demonstrated that even decades of imprisonment had not diminished his dangerous fixation. Meanwhile, Mary and Beth's recovery journey illustrates both the resilience of the human spirit and the long-term impact of severe trauma. Their decision to proceed with the planned missionary work in the Philippines wasn't just returning to normal life. It was a conscious choice to find meaning and purpose in service to others, despite their own suffering. Mary's dedication to sharing her story through interviews and speaking engagements represents another form of courage, the willingness to repeatedly revisit painful memories in order to help other victims of violence. Her transformation from victim to advocate demonstrates how survivors can find healing through helping others, while also serving the broader cause of justice and prevention. The legal legacy of the Ming Sen Shue case extends far beyond the individual convictions and sentences. This case became a crucial precedent in the development of modern stalking laws, victim protection programs, and court security procedures. the systematic nature of Ming's obsession, the progression from surveillance to violence, the sophisticated planning involved in his crimes all provided lawmakers and law enforcement with a template for understanding and preventing similar cases. Perhaps most significantly, this case helped establish the legal framework for recognizing stalking as a distinct category of criminal behavior rather than simply a precursor to other crimes. The year of surveillance Ming conducted before the actual kidnapping, his detailed knowledge of the family's habits and preferences. This elaborate fantasy life centered on his victims all became recognized patterns that could be identified and interrupted before they escalated to violence. The Minnesota law that allows indefinite detention of individuals deemed sexually dangerous to society, which continues to keep Ming imprisoned decades after his original sentence would have expired, reflects society's recognition that some individuals pose such a persistent threat. The traditional sentencing structures are inadequate. Ming's continued threats against the Stauffer family, his complete absence of remorse, his persistent delusions about his relationship with Mary all support the determination that he remains too dangerous for release. The 2019 film, Abducted, the Mary Stauffer story, brought this case to a new generation of viewers, but more importantly, it honored Mary's courage and resilience while raising awareness about the warning signs and long-term impacts of stalking crimes. The movie's focus on Mary's faith and determination, rather than the sensational aspects of her ordeal, reflects a more mature understanding of how to tell these stories in ways that honor victims rather than exploiting their suffering. Today, more than 4 decades after these crimes shocked Minnesota and the nation, Ming Sen Shue remains behind bars, likely to die in prison. His case continues to be studied by law enforcement, mental health professionals, and legal scholars as an example of how obsession can escalate to the most serious crimes and how systematic failures in multiple institutions can allow dangerous individuals to avoid treatment and accountability. But perhaps the most important legacy of this case is the courage shown by Mary and Beth Stauffer, who refused to be defined by their victimization and instead chose to help others through their advocacy and service. Their survival and recovery demonstrate that even the most severe trauma can be overcome through faith, determination, and the support of loving communities. The story of Ming Sen Shue serves as both a chilling reminder of the capacity for human evil and an inspiring testament to the power of human resilience. It illustrates how easily obsession can mask itself as love, how quickly fantasy can become violence, and how important it is for society to recognize and respond to the warning signs before tragedy strikes. In our current era of social media and digital surveillance, where stalking can be conducted from thousands of miles away and personal information is readily available online, the lessons of this case remain more relevant than ever. The technologies may have changed, but the fundamental psychology of obsession and the devastating impact on victims remain constant. The Ming Sen Shue case reminds us that true crime is entertainment, it as education about the darkest aspects of human nature, and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit our fundamental decency and trust. It's a story that honors the memory of Jason Wilkman, celebrates the survival of Mary and Beth Stauffer, and serves as a warning that even in our seemingly safe communities, monsters can hide behind the mask of normalcy for years before revealing their true nature. Most importantly, it's a testament to the truth that evil may triumph temporarily, but it cannot ultimately prevail against courage, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to be permanently broken by even the most horrific circumstances.